This meeting is being recorded.
Hang on a moment.
Okay. Right.
Right. So very good evening to all of you from us here at the Society for Theatre Research. And we're very pleased to have a talk tonight on what is actually a topic that is very, very much in the news, and that is the question of housing and indeed of social housing. Just so you know, the question of increased housing needed for the next generation is very, very much in the news, not only by young people themselves, but by governmental bodies and more. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Katie Beswick, who has moved back to London from the University of Exeter. She's now at the University of Arts, where she's program director in acting and performance. Dr. Beswick's interests are in how social class plays out through theater practice, particularly in relationship between places and performance, and also in sex, sexuality, and hip hop. So she writes for the music magazine Loud and Quiet, and in addition has published numerous scholarly articles and chapters on subjects as diverse as actor training in the National Youth Theatre's outreach programs, Litefeet dance cultures, children's theater, and also critical literacy. She is the author of the book Social Housing in Performance, which was published in 2019 by Bloomsbury. And she's also very busy on the music side with two forthcoming books on hip hop theater. Both of these are collaborations with the artist Conrad Murray. They're entitled Making Hip Hop Theater and Beats and Elements, a Hip Hop Theatre Trilogy. Both of those will be published this year, 2022, by Bloomsbury Methuen. She has edited special issues on postcolonial city, Interventions 2015 with Maya Parma and Esha Sill, and also on housing, art, and activism in studies and theater and performance 2020. So the title of Dr. Beswick's talk tonight is London's Burning, Social Housing, Performance, and Politics of Fire in an Overheated Market. So I'm going to turn over now to Dr. Beswick. And just to remind you, after the talk, there will be some time for questions and also the announcement of our next lecture.
Hi, everyone. Just to say, I got my print copy of my new book, My Making Hip Hop Theatre today. It comes out next month, so it's very nice. And if you're interested in hip hop and theatre, and it's a sort of theatre making manual, so I thought I'd do a little shout out to my book just now. So hello, I'm going to be reading my presentation off of some paper, and my printer only prints in yellow on white paper. So if I take a moment, because I'm struggling, that's why. So welcome to my talk this evening. I'm Katie Beswick. As Valerie's just introduced me in a lot of detail, I won't go into that too much. So I'm here to give a lecture today on London's burning. So I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes. I'll keep my eye on the time. And then hopefully we can open out into a bit of a conversation. Before I start, I just want to note, want to prepare people that there'll be images of fire. Some of those fires that I'll show are fires that people died in. And also I'd ask that nobody shares any images from the presentation on social media. If you do want to TikTok or Twitter or Instagram about any of the content of the presentation, that's fine. But just if you could refrain from images of me or the slides, that would be great. Thank you. So the lecture I'm giving now brings together my burgeoning research interest in contexts of fire with my existing research interests on housing and particularly social housing. So what I'm presenting here this evening is exploratory. It's the first time I've attempted to put together these two subjects, and the first time I've spoken about fire. So what I'm presenting now is a way in for me, a way into thinking about fire as a potent political and cultural entity. I'm not even sure that entity is the right word, but there we go. So when I say that, I mean it both materially and in a symbolic sense. Fire is potent in the exchange of power, from who can make or afford heat to what we allow to burn in the pursuit of capital. And the metaphorical invocations of fire in particular cultures and at particular moments tell us about what is considered important and how social and environmental conditions work to structure psychological responses and psychological cultures. Digging into this terrain and uncovering the way that depictions of fires, resonances of fires through time, and actual instances of real fires at specific moments operate through culture is the task that I'm setting myself as I embark on a new line of inquiry. This new line of inquiry continues my ongoing concern with the cultural, social, and economic conditions of class inequity. As the examples I've sort of indicated above suggest, access to fire, to making oneself safe from fire, they're political issues, and as such, fire is a class issue. Economically, as we've seen with the upcoming rise of energy prices, access to heat and to the production of heat operates along class lines, with the poorest most impacted by rises in prices of fuel prices. But what fire means in a cultural context is also symbolic and class-driven. Think, for example, of the recent middle-class trend for installing log-burning stoves in their country houses versus the image of a Romany traveller cooking over an open fire on the side of the road, which featured in the Channel 4 documentary last night, 60 Days with the Gypsies. That documentary looked at the new bill that's upcoming, which is going to sort of put paid to the traveller tradition of a nomadic lifestyle. So I'm turning to fire now because I see that the current social and political context is a time of fire. And again, I mean this in both a material and a metaphorical sense. The third decade of the 21st century began in flames. In January 2020, bushfires raged, perhaps most scarily in the Amazon, Australia and Siberia, with unprecedented wildfires marking what many ecologists understand as a tipping point in global ecosystems. Billions of animals and plants were killed, and human settlements in forests as well as in towns and cities have been destroyed. The 2020 wildfires act, as fires often do when they spiral out of human control, as a flashpoint for crisis, an indication of failures in the relationship between humans and the land where they live. Standing under a piercing blue sky in Brooklyn, New York in January 2020, as news of the Australian wildfires pinged on the screen of my mobile phone, something terrible, the sensation of something terrible moved through me. Excuse me. The ominous sense that we were out of balance and that the fires symbolized a moment of change. I felt really viscerally in that moment. If this sounds fanciful in retrospect, I'd like to point out that humans are part of the environmental ecosystem and thus subject and sensitive to the shifts in its stability that have twisted us so off kilter in the past couple of years. The erosion of ecosystems has knock-on effects, as theories around the emergence of the novel coronavirus leading to the 2020 pandemic that we're still living with reveal. I'm suggesting that we might see the fires of 2020 as a harbinger, a warning that something had gone terribly wrong and that change was imminent. Fires in both contemporary and historical periods herald change and are recorded in performance forms entangled with wider cultural and political systems. The burnings of the Library of Alexandria in ancient Egypt, for example, has left contemporary society with diminished knowledge of ancient civilizations and has been recorded and referenced in plays, novels, and cultural forms since, from Shakespeare's Cleopatra to Stoppard's Arcadia. So this new project, which ignited the idea from this talk when I was invited to give it, and thank you very much to Eileen and Valerie for facilitating me being able to present this evening. As I outlined earlier, this new project is concerned with the cultural politics of fire, and I've got an emphasis in the project on the 21st century, but I want to contextualize that within a wider cultural and political history where fire has been an elemental catalyst for change, bringing about revolution and destruction, and a powerful metaphorical and rhetorical device in aesthetic and cultural works. Fire is, of course, not only a destructive force, it is also life-sustaining. We use fire to cook, provide heat, and spectacles of fire are part of festivals and celebration rituals across the world. Here in England, Bonfire Night brings together spectacles of political power with the tangible reality of real fires and fire making and fire consumption as we build, burn, and gather around bonfires to mark the failed attempt to blow up the Houses of Parliament, a festival that many of us treat lightheartedly, works to solidify the historical and current position of government and the enduring role of the Houses of Parliament in our systems of power. Of course, as I don't have time to expand in detail here, our parliamentary system is riven with class divisions that ripple outward and often seem impossible to dismantle. So of all the recent fires, the 2017 fire in Grenfell Tower has become a flashpoint for public discussions about housing and inequity, and has been the subject of performance, cultural and literary interventions from figures such as Richard Norton Taylor, who works in documentary theatre, as I'll speak about later, to grime artist Stormzy. Many people from across sort of the class and social divide have been called to comment upon Grenfell. As such, this fire serves as a useful cultural moment with which to organise my thoughts on nature, culture and politics as they relate to fire. So in what remains of this talk, I want to place the Grenfell Tower fire in a wider context of cultures of fire in London and fire and cultures of heat, before talking about the verbatim documentary theatre production Value Engineering. And I want to use this production to think about the ways that class politics operates through representations of fire and how we might deal with the sticky ethics of representing fires born out of conditions of class inequity. The phrase "London's burning," as many of you will be aware, is famously the opening line of a children's nursery rhyme that's associated with the Great Fire of London in 1066, an event in which a 3-day fire ravaged the city and changed it forever. London's burning is also a line that's been used in lots of different cultural representations of London. And when I was trying to think of some today, I could think of London's Burning, which was the 1990s drama set in a London fire station, and the punk rock song London's Burning by The Clash. So this fire marks an important moment in London's history and forms a residual part of the contemporary cultural and physical landscape of London. And when I use the term residual there, I'm referring to Raymond Williams' model of the dominant, residual and emergent, where the residual remains in the sort of current dominant culture and forms part of what emerges out of that. The monument to the Great Fire of London in Fish Street, near the adjacent Monument Tube station, remains a popular tourist attraction, and the legacy of the fire and its impact is inscribed on the monument's column. But the fire also has a lasting legacy in its influence on building regulations, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Immediately following the fire, new regulations were introduced in 1066-67, which included upper floors of houses, which were no longer permitted to jut out over the floors below. There were hanging signs advertising, for example, commerce were banned. All the houses of buildings, whether they were small or large, so any houses or buildings, sorry, whether small or large, were to be built only in brick or stone, and new houses, if they were to be built of other materials, they would be torn down. Obviously, remaining wooden houses were allowed to stay, and wood and thatch were particularly banned. I think that Shakespeare's Globe was the first thatched building allowed in London after those regulations. I might be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure. New fire regulations were introduced that included easy access to water, and these heralded the beginning of the fire hydrant system that still operates in the city. So these regulations and further ones that were introduced in subsequent years have remained intact pretty much for the last 350 years. And a reduction in fatal fires was an immediate and enduring result of this change in legislation. Further acts, such as the Housing Act in 1874 and the Town Planning Act in 1909, came into force as part of further attempts to provide clean, adequate, sanitary and safe dwellings for people to live in. And these measures worked, is the important thing to say. But in the late 20th and into the 21st century, these well-established regulations began to be rolled back and weakened. For example, in 1984, the Building Act significantly shortened the building regulations document. It went from something like 306 pages down to just over 20 pages long. So those changes, those regulations were massively made massively briefer, and therefore gave more leeway for developers and so on to interpret them in ways that suited them. There was also a move in the 1980s and 90s towards competitive tendering. So what that means is that companies bid for building works, developers can bid to carry out certain building works, and normally the most cost effective, so the cheapest tender will win. And therefore there was an incentive for developers to push costs down. And this sat alongside deregulation in the 1990s. So in the 1990s, manufacturers started being able to carry out their own tests on their products to make sure that they fit building regulations, rather than these being carried out by external validation panels and local authorities and so on. So along with these regulations to building works, there were also a raft of reductions in costs of public spending, such as the cessation of mandatory hydrant checks by fire services servicing the actual area where they worked. So I found this out, tragically enough, when a fire broke out, a domestic fire, which was fatal, broke out in the road where I lived, and the fire services couldn't find the fire hydrant. And when I was asking a relative who's a firefighter why that was, they explained to me that up until very recently, fire services had carried out their own mandatory weekly checks on fire hydrants. So they just knew as part of their day-to-day job where all the fire hydrants were in the area, but that this job had been put out to tender and external companies were now doing it, often not doing it. But what that meant on the ground was that firefighters aren't aware in their day-to-day practice always of where the hydrants are in their local area. So all of this, these less safe building practices, this rolling back in kind of public services, has led to more risk for London residents, and especially for those living in low cost and social housing, where cost cutting practices have often been concentrated, and where the significant impact of building regulations have often been seen due to urban redevelopment since the new Labour government. Urban redevelopment has often focused on working class and low income districts and areas with large areas of social housing. When the social housing block Lakanal House in Camberwell, London, broke out in a fire in 2009, in which 6 residents died, the scaling back of building regulations and oversight in building safety was immediately identified by commenters as a potential causal factor in the fire, and it was also suggested it had provided a hindrance to the fire brigade in their rescue attempts. In 2017, Southwark Council pled guilty to charges concerning breaches of safety at Lakanal House and was fined £270,000. That was reduced from an initial £400,000. And the council expressed their regret at the slipping standards that had led to the fire. But I think that we can see this as part of a kind of structural system that has rolled back safety across the board, and it's no surprise really that the first people it's affected are the kind of those living in housing designated for low income people. So paradoxically, perhaps, the deregulation of building safety practices and the heightened risk this has entailed has coincided with a massively overheated housing market. So I had a look today at the property website Zoopla to see what the average price of houses sold in London in the last 12 months was, and it was £705,783, which I found quite staggering, because when I looked this time last year, it was something like £500,000. So even with everything that's been going on, the market's continued to heat. So this puts home ownership out of reach for almost everyone on an average income, and even perhaps a high income, unless you're extremely wealthy now. Buying a home in London is very, very difficult unless you've got family wealth. And even renting has become increasingly difficult. I looked at HomeLet today, which puts average rental prices in the city at £1,760 per month. And that's before bills, obviously, council tax, food, and so on. And the average London income is about £2,500 a month. So you can see that there's a massive discrepancy there. And obviously that average income will be massively skewed because people earn such high salaries in the city and so on. So again, this state of affairs, access to housing, disproportionately affects working class people who are priced out of the city and for whom social housing and affordable housing provision has been massively reduced, in a large part as a result of developments which have removed social housing provision in order to maximise profits for developers. So these conditions, I propose, have consequences for the politics of performance and theatrical representation, particularly in the area of working class representation. In September 2021, the Working Class Artists Group, who are a collective of 33 working class artists and producers living and working in the UK, released a statement criticizing the announcement of a new theatrical production, Value Engineering, Scenes from the Grenfell Inquiry. So this play offers a verbatim documentary account of elements of the public inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire, which was a horrific tragedy, as I'm sure most of you know, in which 72 people died following a domestic fire in a tower block on the social housing estate, Lancaster West in West London in June 2017. We do not believe, the Working Class Artists Group wrote, that it is the right decision to create this work while victims are still in temporary accommodation or displaced from their community, while families are awaiting answers to who will be held responsible. The fire at Grenfell Tower, which would ordinarily have been contained to a single dwelling due to the inherent inbuilt fire safety of the original concrete structure, spread uncontrollably because of combustible and poorly installed cladding, which had recently been affixed to the external walls of the tower block as part of a wider redevelopment project on the Lancaster West estate. So as I'll outline in more detail in a minute, Grenfell Tower has become a cultural shorthand for discussions about the relationship between housing, economic injustice, and wider forms of class and race inequity in London and the UK more widely. In this talk, I want to consider the complex ethical terrain that value engineering navigates as an artistic representation of the Grenfell Tower fire, which purports a documentary status within a wider context of social and political inequity within and beyond the theatre industry. The fire, I propose, exemplifies structural violence in its most literal form and demonstrates the ways in which the London housing crisis serves as a canary in the coal mine. And I'm using that sort of anachronistic idiom because of its class-based origins, which I'll go into a bit later. So the London housing crisis is a canary in the coal mine for neoliberal policy, the dismantling of the welfare state and its attendant social, ecological and cultural impacts. So I'm going to talk a bit about the political context and ask what might be at stake in cultural representations of this nationally significant event, what we risk in representing and regarding the pain of other people, and how and whether notions of solidarity might be reconciled with notions of ownership in cultural forms. So what I'm trying to do really is give some consideration to the concerns raised by the working class artist group, and also to offer a way into understanding the complexity of the controversies surrounding Grenfell value engineering and the kind of current housing context. So when images of Grenfell Tower burning in Inferno were transmitted across news and social media throughout the night and into the day of the 14th of June 2017, those of us who'd been involved in studying and campaigning about the state of London's housing crisis were horrified, but largely unsurprised. It had long been clear that those living in Britain's council estates or social housing estates were in grave danger as a result of the perilous advance of regeneration that has rapidly changed the face of London's built environment and compromised safety, particularly since the turn of the 21st century. The regeneration of the city's estates, which has happened as part of wider redevelopment projects intended to improve areas, primarily through increasing the economic value of real estate in those areas, has exposed massive fissures in the social contract and has often reduced the numbers of dwellings available for low and average income earners, and it's frequently displaced from their homes those who cannot afford to buy or rent privately. Anna Minton's book, Big Capital, who is London 4, goes in a lot of detail about that for those of you that haven't read it and are interested. Paul Watt, who's also recently written a book about regeneration and housing in London, writes that, and I'm quoting here, "Housing is the most palpable manifestation of London's inequality," end quote. It exposes inequities of wealth, health, safety, and well-being that are, as he writes, disproportionately borne by London's multi-ethnic working class population who reside in the city's social housing estates or in the insecure private rented sector. So the perilous state of housing insecurity borne by working class people in London is evidence of wider systemic failures exacerbated by politics of austerity that have stripped back the welfare state since at least 2010. In his 2019 report, I'm sure most of you already know this, but I'll map it out anyway. There was a visit to the UK and Ireland by the Special Rapporteur, Philip Alston, and he argued that post-World War II, British society, the United Nations Special Rapporteur, I should say, he highlighted how post-World War II British society had been held together by a raft of policy and welfare provisions, and that those had been systemically dismantled under a 21st century neoliberal ideology and replaced with what he called an uncaring ethos. So in this system, as numerous sociologists have shown, such as Imogen Tyler and Lisa Mackenzie, Beverly Skeggs, working class people are stigmatized, devalued, and deprived to the point that their existence becomes expendable. Paul Watt illustrates the way that this expendability is cemented and connected into housing provision. Urban development projects that displace and further stigmatise the poorest members of society are part of wider neoliberal cultures in which urban space is systematically rearranged for the benefit of capitalist developers and their local state accomplices, while the result is displacement and the erosion of working class rights to the city. Paul Watt says that, that's a Paul Watt quote. So because housing is a basic human need, and because rising real estate prices impact almost everybody in both private and rental markets, housing has become a canary in the coal mine for neoliberal policy. That is, the overheated housing market poses precarity and instability for social housing tenants, private renters, and even homeowners who face greater levels of indebtedness and concurrent insecurity. The charity Shelter describes this in their report into what they call the housing crisis. They explain how the results of housing precarity are not merely effective in that they cause felt distress and what Paul Watt calls multiple discontents, but are part of an atmosphere of impending danger and failure, which can result in disastrous consequences, including death. So I use the analogy of canary in the coal mine to describe the landscape of housing in London in order to draw out a working class history that is obviously also related to histories of heat and coal and fire, The phrase refers to the cage canaries which miners had carried down to the mine during shifts, and the birds' greater susceptibility to noxious gases such as carbon monoxide meant they'd die or fall unconscious, providing a warning to miners that the atmosphere was no longer safe and that they should find a means of escape. In London, housing conditions provide a warning that the atmosphere of hyper-commodification under neoliberalism is no longer safe, and that lives are at risk as a result of overarching political structures that govern the essential aspects of our lives, such as access to housing. In the case of Grenfell Tower, the disaster was directly linked to neoliberal policy and the agendas governing urban development. Policies that John Bolton argues are characterised by a near universal contemporary model of regeneration dependent on opaque public-private partnerships and private capital and driven by commercial interests. Grenfell was part of a larger redevelopment project, conceived in part to improve the aesthetic appeal of the building and its surrounds by cladding the concrete facade of the tower in a more visually appealing exterior, better in keeping with the affluent district in which the estate was located. The redevelopment was beset with safety failures, mainly pertaining to the external cladding affixed to Grenfell. These safety failures resulted in a catastrophic fire, which might have been prevented had the complaints of the tenants who lived in the building been heeded. Grenfell Tower's residents had complained for a long time that their building was unsafe, and in a now deleted blog post published in November 2016, a group of residents predicted that a catastrophic event resulting in serious loss of life was imminent. That these residents' concerns were overlooked and ignored has featured in much of the coverage and commentary surrounding the fire and its aftermath. As Imogen Tyler noted before Grenfell Tower burned, neoliberalism relies on creating wasted, expendable humans, positioned as other to a supposedly normative middle class. The devaluing of the poorest members of the UK's multi-ethnic working classes, many of whom live in social housing, has been understood as a central aspect of the fire by a number of sociologists that have written about it, including Tyler, Mackenzie and others. In other words, many people understand that the residents of Grenfell Tower died in large part because they were working class and thus were considered less than fully human. The fire was a direct result of a system that devalued their lives to the point of expendability. So it's this context in which the Working Class Artists Group released their statement criticising the decision to stage value engineering. And the statement also needs to be understood within the wider culture of class injustice in the UK, which extends beyond housing and into the creative industries, including, and perhaps especially, the theatre. As recent research in cultural policy and performance studies has indicated, working class people, and particularly working class people of colour, are hugely underrepresented in the creative industries. And this means that stories and artworks created about working class people and communities are very often not created or controlled by or even with working class people. As a result, groups such as the Working Class Artists Group, the now defunct organisation Common, and various working class artists have campaigned for better and more equitable access to the arts and have worked to call out instances of class-based injustice. So given that value engineering was written and directed by well-known, established theatre makers who are part of the sort of what I would call the elite middle-class theatre culture, Nicholas Kent and Richard Norton Taylor, who'd pioneered the documentary mode in the 1990s, and given that it was also staged with a mostly white, presumably mostly middle-class cast, the Working Class Artists Group statement might be understood as a pushback against an elite culture which excludes and ignores working class people, while at the same time taking ownership over stories with working class people at their centre. When working class people so infrequently have access to the means of producing their own narratives on their own terms, or accessing the institutions that produce such narratives, the ethics of telling the stories of working class tragedies is rightfully called into question. Taking the words of communities more marginalized than you without making a long-term structural difference to the material conditions of that community is unethical, wrote the Working Class Artists Group, when the makers of value engineering responded to the Working Class Artists Group initial statement with the verbatim words of the only Black barrister in the inquiry. So the ethical complexities of working class representation within overarching violent structures of inequity push up against the necessity of heeding the canary in the coal mine epitomised by Grenfell. So in other words, yes, you can criticise the ethics of staging working class stories, but there's also a case to be made for, I guess, the consciousness raising of the kind facilitated by value engineering. The more that knowledge about injustices constituting a housing emergency spreads, the less likely we are to collectively tolerate conditions of housing injustice. At least in theory, you know, that's what consciousness raising does. I'm not sure whether that works in practice. And as Susan Sontag asked in her 2003 essay regarding the pain of others, what does it mean to protest suffering as distinct from acknowledging it? Is representation enough? Complicating the ethical terrain further, I think, in this particular instance, are some of the fact that some of these debates are happening on social media, which is obviously automatically quite a polarizing forum for these debates to happen in. So value engineering then, it's the latest of the tribunal plays, a mode of theatre developed by Nicholas Kent and Richard Norton Taylor at the Tricycle Theatre, with a series of works that they produced between 93 and 2011, which developed documentary theatre modes that had emerged in the 1960s and 70s. Tribunal plays, as Dan Rebellato outlines, are plays whose source material generally comes from a public inquiry, from which most of the public has no direct access. At their best, they correct the deficits that blight our democracy, they reveal vulnerabilities of power, and in their stately way, they can be massively rousing, shocking, and devastating. So examples of documentary or tribunal plays include Nuremberg, which staged elements of the Nuremberg trials, that was staged in 96, and The Colour of Justice, staged in 99, a dramatisation of the inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which was adapted into a TV movie and offered a platform that showcased how the police mishandling of the case was underpinned by institutional racism. And I think that play and the sort of subsequent inquiries into institutional racism has had a really big effect as well on the theatre industry and the performing arts industry in the way that we think about institutional racism within our own houses, as it were. So value engineering similarly sought to present elements of the public inquiry that might distill the major concerns of that inquiry for an audience unable to access the inquiry itself. It was staged in a very formal courtroom style, with actors using the verbatim words of the inquiry participants speaking those words that were edited for longer transcripts. So the piece centrally, as the title suggests, works to draw attention to value engineering, which is a mode of cost-cutting by corporate interests that's revealed through the performance as completely blind to the dangers, despite numerous warnings. So the ethical terrain which value engineering traverses is complex, not only because the corruption, ineptitude and corporate greed that's showcased on stage is rife within the property redevelopment sector, but also because of the mode and context of the production. The Tabernacle Theatre, where the play was staged, is located in Notting Hill in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, a distance of less than a mile from the Lancaster West estate, of which Grenfell Tower was a part. As a review in The Guardian noted, this proximity carries a heavy symbolism. Given the wealth and affluence of Notting Hill in relation to Lancaster West, it's not just wealth inequity that's pertinent here, it's class inequities that characterise UK theatre that are also really obvious in the theatre space, and they emerge in material ways throughout the production as an apparently affluent, middle class, almost entirely white audience, at least on the night I attended, sits in stark contrast to the profile of the victims of the tragedy, who were mainly ethnic minority and working class. The ethical stickiness here is further compounded by the fact that value engineering is staged before the conclusion of the inquiry, and before anyone's been held accountable, let alone prosecuted for the deaths of those who perished in the fire. The otherness of the victims in relation to the surroundings, audience, production team, and so on is emphasised by their absence from the performance, where the dead exist only as victims, and the presentation of the inquiry reduces their humanity to questions of the failures of neoliberal governance. This is not least because the victims, and indeed the reality of the fire itself, exists mainly as a subject to the performance, and the performance therefore relies on an empathetic response, which is incidental to the business of the play. So there is no kind of attempt to depict the victims in any sort of human sense, for the most part, I would say. The documentary status of tribunal theatre, I think, introduces further ethical questions around staging the pain of the other. The inquiry testimony is presented in an ostensibly neutral staging with minimal theatricality. Rebellato describes how, in the staging of value engineering, the formal business of the inquiry creates a patina of mostly rational, unemotional calm. So this works to reinforce the documentary nature of the play, and it coats the performance in a realism that disavows its distance from the actual inquiry. This is, after all, an interpretation of the thing and not the thing itself. In Susan Sontag's writing on war photography, she questions the role of the photographic document in allowing us the ability to regard the pain of others. Photographs, Sontag argues, present, and I'm quoting here, both objective record and personal testimony, both a faithful copy or transcription of an actual moment of reality and an interpretation of that reality. Documentary theatre operates in a similar way, seeking, like the photographic document, to present a transparent reality, which nonetheless, in fact, again, like the photographic document, represents the view of someone, as Sontag says. The intervention of an interpretive hand in the dramaturgy of value engineering is concealed by the formal bureaucratic nature of the production, but is nonetheless there in the devices used in editing the transcripts into a narrative sense. So there's one moment in the performance that struck me particularly, and it's early on, and it's maybe the only moment in which the sort of voices of the victims and those there that night comes to the fore. And it's where a firefighter is relaying his attempt to save a 13-year-old boy from an upper floor apartment as the fire raged. So the selected elements and mode of staging this section created a narrative interpretation in which, had the firefighter attempted to knock on the doors of the flats on lower floors as he ascended the building, lives may have been saved. So that this is patently not the way that first response services generally operate, as the firefighter himself explains. In an emergency situation, a single task is carried out to completion without diversion, and that's to ensure the safety of officers and the organisation of the wider team. So there's not really a realistic sense in which that officer would ever have diverted himself from the task of rescuing that boy to knock on doors and rescue other people. That's just not how it works. But that reality had little impact on the audience response to the stage testimony. Again, at least on the night I attended. During the interval, a conversation emerged around me in which the consensus was that, had the firefighter used common sense, lives would have been saved. And that sort of criticism of the fire service was also part of the findings of the inquiry, which have been heavily contested by the Fire Brigades Union, and I think rightly, because they are unreasonable findings. But again, the play presents the sort of narrative of the inquiry as a kind of fait accompli rather than as an interpretation. The acknowledgement of interpretation in the staging of documentary theatre is important in passing the ethical complexity of the performance, I think, because as the Working Class Artists Group suggests in their criticism of value engineering, who represents reality has an effect on what is said and on the way that the world is understood, and the world of the play, as well as the world at large, I suppose. So the notion of a neutral, objective mediation of reality conceals wider structures of inequity that silences the voices of working class people, making it harder for those such as the residents of Grenfell to be heard when they leverage complaints. So what I'm saying there really is the fact that when the Grenfell Tower residents complained about the fact their building was unsafe, that wasn't listened to. That has something to do with the cultural politics about who we hear speaking and who has authority to make claims to public space, to expertise and so on in the public domain. So there are problems, I think, with value engineering and its ethics of preservation and its intervention into that particular fire. Nonetheless, as Sontag argues, though a mediated document cannot capture an embodied experience, and while there are ethical dangers in representing other people's tragedy, remembering is an ethical act, has ethical value in and of itself. Memory is achingly the only relation we can have with the dead, so that the belief that remembering is an ethical act is deep in our nature as humans, who know we're going to die and who mourn those who in the normal course of things die before us. The ability of a play such as value engineering to serve as a call to memory is thus perhaps where its ethics emerge, and where we might understand it as a call to empathy through a shared humanity. And I'm not saying that this necessarily works, but that there is an ethical value in that. At the close of the performance, a list of the victims' names is displayed on a screen, which had earlier shown the burning building. Though this display of their names does little to emphasise the individual human cost of the tragedy, it does provide a moment of embodied collective reflection and public mourning, which, however, individuals in the audience feel that they have to participate in. I mean, unless they want to sort of get up and walk out in front of everybody, which nobody did, at least on the night I was there. And that sort of draws attention in and of itself to our ethical responsibilities to one another, and might foster some solidarity across class divisions. This solidarity is fleeting and certainly fails to address in any practical way the real injustices of Grenfell and the wider conditions of housing for the poorest London residents. Nonetheless, though it can never deliver ethical retribution, the staging of the event serves as a catalyst for remembrance, facilitates a sustainment of public awareness around Grenfell, and that public conversation, such as my talking about the performance tonight, might contribute to a growing consensus that current housing conditions and the wider neoliberal political culture are deadly and unsustainable for us all, and are part of the reason why we are living in this time of fire. So thank you. That's the end of my lecture. I hope we can have a bit of a chat about it now.
Lovely. Thank you very, very much, Katie. If you can close down your share screen, I will go back into mine. And I'm just going to open sorry, I just have to unmute somebody here. I'm just going to ask people if they have some questions, which I will then relay through to Katie. I've got something up here in chat at the moment. Okay. Please plug a talk Zoom. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So anyone wish to open this conversation here? Otherwise I will. Right. So I guess the genesis of value engineering is itself interesting, because it has obviously the legacy of the tribunal plays at the then Tricycle, now the Kiln. And the format is sort of tried and true through Richard Norton Taylor, obviously. But why choose that format? Did they ever say anything about why they wanted to do it as this, as you say, rather objective looking tribunal format rather than another kind? Oops, we've got some, yeah.
I don't know that that's ever addressed. It may have been. I haven't found anything where they specifically address why. I think it was a public inquiry that obviously around an event that had a lot of public attention, and I imagine that the producers just felt there would be an appetite for that play. And I do think there is something to be said for the digestible format in which the inquiry is then presented to the audience, because most people aren't going to read, thousands and thousands of pages of a transcript of a public inquiry. But I do wonder.
I mean, it does
about the organisation of that material, really, and why, there must, choices are made about what to include and what not to include, that lead your interpretation down a particular path. And I suppose that just isn't acknowledged in the form of tribunal theatre in general, which presents itself as kind of documentary theatre.
Yeah, also the genesis of this, I think, the who funded it, who was kind of the crudely stated, who is behind the money to launch this at the Tabernacle? Was it like an Arts Council grant? Was it a local authority? Because that also would impact how the piece is put together and structured. Do we know anything about that? Oh, sorry, you need to unmute yourself.
I don't know who funded the play, honestly, and I think that's a really good insight and question. I imagine I know that there was some charity associated with it, and I know that some of this proceeds went to the Grenfell Survivors Group. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether that was in response to the criticism about the works. My understanding is that it was a joint production between the Playground Theatre and an organisation called Nick of Time Productions, which I think is a commercial theatre making enterprise. So it was a commercial play. It wasn't funded by the local authority, as far as I know.
I'm sorry, I'm asking all the questions. Those of you who are out there, if you'd like to, maybe let's go into gallery view. Would that help? Yeah, maybe. For those of you who'd like to be in gallery view, we'll go there. Or if you'd like to just type in any questions that you have into the chat panel, please do that. Otherwise I shall carry on talking. Yeah, I guess what sort of interested me was, I think it was in September, there was an article in Metro, which is of course a free sheet, and it was the criticism about the casting. It was amongst other things what you said, the Grenfell residents hadn't been rehomed, yet people are using the story as cannon fodder. Somebody, the activist and writer Gina Martin said, "I don't want to see a theater production make any money off the back of a horrendous tragedy." And she also said, unless all the money is going to the families and individuals affected who still don't have justice, she believes that it shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that because of that criticism, they did that. Certainly I bought the play text, and the money, they said the profit from the play text was going to the victims. I imagine that was in response to that kind of criticism. There was a lot of it. I mean, I think it's kind of, it's a kind of difficult question. This is why I sort of said I think it's also all exacerbated by social media culture at the moment, because these kind of absolute diktats about what is and what isn't allowed to be represented are a little bit ridiculous, because it's a massive cultural event. Of course people are going to make artworks about a huge cultural event, but the way that that's done, I mean, it's reasonable to criticize it, and it's reasonable to think about what are the ethics of what's being done. For me, I think it's also it's also interesting to, I think Grenfell Tower gets taken up as kind of as a cause, and what isn't acknowledged is the kind of wider systemic issues that it represents, and therefore the play is kind of useful in that sense, because it does draw attention to the fact that this is not this is not necessarily this could happen again and again and again, and it's part of a rolling back of safety. And I don't know, I think some of the other creative responses to the fire that I've seen have been very personal. So so that kind of wider political context about housing safety is useful, I think.
Yeah, we've got a indication here about the funding of the play. It was Paul Hamlin Foundation and Joseph Roundtree who funded it. Got a question here.
Thanks, Lynn.
I'll read. I was interested that you acknowledged the blurry ethical boundary between the production making the inquiry accessible and the working class artist's critique of it. There is a dilemma, isn't there? If the production hadn't happened, then a lot of people, maybe including people with the power to do something, wouldn't know about it. Where do we draw a line? What is censorship and what is retreat as an ethical position? Quite a lot going on there. So I'll just put the questions out there. Where do we draw a line? What is censorship and what is retreat as an ethical position?
I mean, I don't believe in censorship, but I think it's okay to have the discussion about is it ethical to put something on. I also think that the idea that the power to do so, who does have the power to do something, it always comes back to it's the people with the money, isn't it? And they are not the people that are attending the play, and they already know what the issues are.
Yeah.
So I think the other problem with putting on something like this is that it highlights a problem, and you're sort of stuck because everybody is kind of screaming, well, obviously, we need to go back to building regulations that make sense, and we need to kind of disinvest in this, in our whole economy being structured around a housing market that's massively overinflated. But yeah, that isn't something that most people who are watching the play can do anything about.
Yeah. I've got a question here. My understanding was the play was not, and then it just says RES. I'm not quite sure what that means.
I think I don't know what it means either. I presumed it was about the funding for it, which Lynn's just clarified.
Yeah. There's also, I think Professor Newey has kind of raised the ethical position with all these sorts of docudramas or verbatim pieces dealing with social justice. And that is, there is that dilemma of the people who have control over representation, as you said, are the people with money. So then what happens to those who are disempowered, except that they become, as you said, they become victims, they become faceless victims in this story. I mean, there has been one particularly pointed Twitter feed that came up in that Metro article that says, focus the play on victim stories, right? Not just the white folks in charge, because that would be a horrible whitewash, making Grenfell residents victims all over again. Ending rather provocatively, is this art or racism? I'm not sure what we would want to make of that, because as you said, it is important that people who have the means of representation raise these issues. So any thoughts on this strange question?
Well, I think it's, again, Twitter is very polarizing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And a tribunal play, it's trying to do the job of being a document that reflects reality. I don't think anything can really do that. So I think it's always a bit disingenuous to present that. But they try to cast people who are something like the people that were in the tribunal. So most of the people who spoke at the tribunal were white figures of power. So that is reflecting I guess the reality of the inquiry, and drawing attention to the fact that the inquiry did not include a huge number of kind of working class people of color speaking at it. Again, I mean, I don't know that the I don't know that there is like an answer to whether or not this was kind of a good play to put on. I think that the question though is around the profile of this particular production, and around, you know, it had a huge profile, and was written about widely, and the kind of theatre that is going to stage this kind of play, whereas, you know, there have been many kind of community productions coming out of social housing estates where residents have been dealing with issues around Grenfell. There have been lots of working class artists for many years, including during and after Grenfell, making plays about social housing crisis, and they tend not to be put on mainstream stages. So that question about even why, you know, organisations like the Paul Hamlin Foundation, Joseph Rowntree, which have a social kind of interest, you know, social purpose, you know, why they're funding this type of work as opposed to other types of work. And again, that's just about the whole structural system of the theatre, I guess, works in the same way as the whole structural system elsewhere, is that it constantly reinforces its own elitist structures. So if you put on a production at a first class venue, you're going to get huge coverage in the media, and your message is going to be received widely. Whereas those kind of working class artists that are making work about Grenfell, that are on at fringe venues, at community venues, that they don't get any coverage, even though actually I've seen a lot of those productions as well, and they're a lot better in my, like, formally more innovative, they're more complex, they acknowledge their own kind of ethical complicity, all of that stuff exists in those plays, but they tend not to be the ones that are funded, even when the funding, you know, comes from organizations that purport to have kind of a social justice mission.
And that itself is very interesting, isn't it? The kinds of choices that are being made. I also noticed from the website linked to this is they also issued an education pack, and I'm just wondering what was the kind of outreach, or was there any outreach, and what was the life of this play? I mean, they've created an education pack, but did this also become sort of seen by schools or by, you know, people?
Well, I doubt it would have gone into, I don't think it, I'm almost certainly didn't go into schools because of COVID and the pandemic and so on, but it did tour beyond the Tabernacle. I'm kind of interested to know how it would have felt in other venues, because there was something about watching it, I think, in Notting Hill, you know, right in the sort of shadow of the inquiry, with all of those kind of class inequities that are kind of, when you're somewhere, you know, in parts of West London that are so wealthy, it's just so obvious. And so that gave everything, for me anyway, like a particular flavour. And I don't know if that flavour will have worked in other venues. I guess, again, you know, it is quite standard for theatres to invite school groups in and to issue education packs when they've got a printed play text, particularly around a social issue like that.
Right. Okay. Well, I think, are there any further questions up here? I'm just, okay. We've got one comment here that's come up. My understanding was that the play was not trying to convey the pain and sufferings of the victims of Grenfell, which, as you rightly say, is near impossible, but about the failure of regulations and the failure of the companies involved to prioritize safety rather than financial profit. As such, it may have achieved its purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that message was very clear in the production. I agree. It's whether the means sort of justify the outcome, isn't it? I suppose it's whether the to stage a performance where no kind of working class people, where those communities are not kind of actively involved in that conversation, you know, that was the question the working class artist group they weren't asking the question. They were saying that is unethical to make a play like that, whatever the means of doing it or whatever the sort of aim of it is. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that finding, but I do think it's interesting to sort of poke a little bit at those questions, because I do think that where you stage something, you know, who comes to see it, who needs to see it, who needs to hear those messages about what's happening. Did anybody in that audience not already know the way that kind of these neoliberal infrastructures work to kind of conceal deregulation of building safety? So I think there's lots of other kind of questions that bubble up that I maybe didn't get to them all in the presentation. But yes, I definitely think that one of the things the play did really well, and the play text did really well, was just illustrate like the way that complexity is used in this kind of financial neoliberal model to assign blame elsewhere, to kind of you're constantly deferring responsibility to the next and the next and the next person, and the web of kind of infrastructure is so complicated. I thought it did that really well.
Yeah, presenting that also clarifies what looks like a rather Kafkaesque scenario if we're just, you know, out there reading it. Katie, I'd like to thank you very, very much for joining us here tonight with this, I'd say, very timely and indeed still ongoing issue about certainly issues of representation in verbatim and docudrama and the social housing crisis. Also questions about the notion of the editing of reality, you know, and what that does. Of course, all of these sorts of plays do edit, but you've raised some very provocative and interesting perspectives on that. So I'd really like to thank you for your time. And I'm now very curious to read the book as well. I'm just going to share a screen for a moment and I'll come back to you just to let people know our next event. So our next event is also going to be online, and we're jumping from a very contemporary 21st century back to the 19th with Edward Sterling, Victorian actor, adapter, and bigamist, with readings from his plays, including The Cabin Boy. The Cabin Boy falls into a category not dissimilar for some of the plays dealing with questions of melodrama, questions also of race and representation. So please join us on the 23rd of March. Just to also let our audience know, we will be online for March and April, and we'll hopefully be returning alive and very much in real life for our AGM. So I'll just go back to say thanks again to Katie, and I've really enjoyed this talk. I hope all of you have as well. Okay, thank you then. Right, good night, everybody. Bye.